Hotez says you better be afraid because measles, rubella and polio are going to come back like apocalyptic horsemen and destroy you. So who do we believe? Hello there, you awakening wonders. Remember, we stream exclusively on Rumble. You should get Rumble Premium because you get an ad-free experience where people speak freely. And what better example is there of the necessity of free speech than the pandemic era and what we learned during that? What we learned and what we now know is $1 billion was spent on propagandizing the population. We know this because Bhattacharya, unbelievably, if he's confirmed, the new head of the NIH revealed that to us. Yet Peter Hotez, who's one of the acolytes who hangs around the administrative bureaucracies that seem to integrate the needs of Big Pharma and your tax dollars being funneled into projects that facilitate and benefit them, wants you to be afraid of mumps, measles, rubella, and other old school diseases. Some people might say the reason there are old school diseases is because of the efficacy of vaccines. But we are in a time where vaccines are being scrutinized like never before. In particular, the indemnity that's granted to that class of medicines that is unique and likely means that the business model is bent in favor towards vaccine manufacture because there is less risk of censure or penalty in that area uniquely. So were we propagandized during the pandemic? Is Bhattacharya right to say that $1 billion was spent terrifying you and your family into taking a medication about which they knew less than they claim? And how do we use that information to understand what Peter Hotez is saying about measles, mumps and rubella? Let's get into it.
Well, here's the big worry, John. This kind of anti-vaccine rhetoric is part of a larger coordinated disinformation campaign.
Amazing. So he's talking about anti-vaccine rhetoric and a larger coordinated anti-vaccine campaign. Have you noticed that the enemy does what they accuse their opponents of doing? In a minute, we're going to learn that $1 billion was spent on propagandizing a population, and yet Peter Hotez here accuses that information, much of which I believe is true. The information, by the way, I mean, that criticizes or at least questions the efficacy of vaccines, the legitimacy of mandates, the state measures that took place across the world during that period, the many factors within the WHO treaty that seem designed to facilitate control and profit rather than benefit people. And that's when you start getting near to the fundamental principles. Do you trust these bureaucracies? Do you trust power? Do you believe for even 1 second that at the beating heart, therefore myocarditis-free heart, of the establishment is your best interest? Or do you imagine that these institutions and interests align with one another in order to facilitate their own agenda?
And the consequences we're now seeing. We've had not only an increase in measles outbreaks, as was just reported, from 4 to 16 from 2023 to 2024, we've had a 5-fold rise in pertussis, otherwise known as whooping cough, and now there's polio that's been reported in the wastewater in New York State in 2022. John, this is a very fragile vaccine ecosystem. It doesn't take much for these diseases to come back.
If you were watching this through the lens of they live, you would see obey, be afraid, obey, be afraid, be afraid, be afraid. What we should have here is Robin Williams' famous comment that they should be forced, these commentators, these politicians, these lawmakers, to wear the emblems of their sponsors. Who does Peter Hotez work for? Who does number 2 work for?
And you've got to maintain constant vigilance. So the case, for instance, excuse me,
Excuse me, Mayor, I'm just sharded, possibly as a result of a vaccine injury.
The measles, the polio case that we had in a 20-year-old individual a couple of years ago who wasn't vaccinated, that could happen very easily. And so all of these could look like they're on their way up and coming back fairly quickly. And we're not being out there enough really countering the anti-vaccine rhetoric. And there is no relationship with any of these vaccines and autism.
Well, that's going to be investigated. We'll soon have proper scientific information and evidence to investigate that claim rather than assurances that come from people that are invested in particular. I suppose it would be dangerous and harmful to vaccine manufacturers and big pharma more generally if vaccines were no longer granted indemnity.
And that's why I get so frustrated with people like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. He keeps on switching up what his actual assertions are.
He is annoying, isn't he, Bobby Kennedy Jr., being an outspoken critic of the interests of big pharma and regulatory bodies that seem to have a revolving door with the big pharma companies that they're supposed to regulate. That is annoying. Let's have a look at Jay Bhattacharya. One of the great victories of the Maha MAGA movement is that a man like Jay Bhattacharya, who I can personally testify is a man of integrity and authority, who is a Stanford University scientist and professor, who was attacked during the pandemic, smeared and decried and defamed because, in particular, of the Great Barrington Declaration, which, when you read it in hindsight, looks like common sense. You don't vaccinate at the height of pandemics. You should have more clinical trial data on transmission. Maybe herd immunity would be a good idea. You should possibly be shielding and vaccinating the most vulnerable. Oh no, you're a lunatic. These people aren't even actually anti-vaccine. Many of the people that are called anti-vaxxers invented vaccines. And the rhetoric and language that is actually propagandist is the language being used by those that are advocating for the interests of big pharma, and they are panicking now because the jig is up because of you, thankfully, consuming independent media. Most coffee out there is basically the liquid equivalent of a participation trophy. Bland, mass-produced, utterly forgetful. But peaberry beans, they're not here to play nice. You get yourself that peaberry, you'll know you've been caffeinated. It's 1775, baby. These rare little rebels make up less than 10% of the entire coffee harvest. Instead of sticking to the crowd, they grow solo, resulting in a denser, more intense bean that doesn't just follow the herd. These beans are grown at high altitudes and are hand-picked at their peak, because if you're going to do something, do it right, yeah? Do them beans right. Thanks to their unique solo act, peaberries deliver richer flavors, a smoother finish, and a touch more caffeine to keep you sharp and focused, like the universe intended. This isn't your corporate coffee sludge. This is for those who see through the nonsense and demand a cup that's as real as it gets. Why settle for anything less than the sweetest peaberries, those rarest among beans? So if you're tired of sipping on mediocrity, go to 1775coffee.com. Use my special code BRAND to get 15% off. Don't just wake up properly to 1775. Revolutionary coffee in the revolution against mediocrity. Let's have a look at Jay Bhattacharya spelling this stuff out for us.
The HHS commissioned a public relations firm named Forrest Marshberg in September of 2020, and then spent almost $1 billion over the course of the Biden administration, essentially to propagandize the American public. Their themes were the main goal was to tell people that if you don't get the COVID vaccine, you are unclean. And they fear-mongered about the risk to kids. They pushed forward false ideas about natural immunity, where they said essentially denied its existence. They did everything they possibly could to tell you about the benefits of the vaccine, but never once told you about the potential harms, right? So, for instance, the side effects for myocarditis for young men, as best I can tell, never came up once.
In particular, I want to draw your attention to the idea that they suggested that people that didn't take the vaccine were unclean. Why I think that's fascinating is because that's connected. Suppose what you could do is shame people. You could make them feel unclean and afraid. You could make them feel that if they didn't take that vaccine, they were putting people in their family at risk. I actually marvel at the ingenuity of that. I marvel at the ingenuity as well as the darkness of it, the willingness to use social techniques worthy of Goebbels. Why would you do that if your intention was just to help people?
Did any of their ads, and they put these ads into like the most vulnerable populations. It essentially was $1 billion spent by the taxpayer to propagandize the American people.
And in terms of the risk-reward, not just risk-reward, but the informed consent that we were offering our patients, I would argue we are still generally not giving them proper informed consent. We are offering only 2 vaccines when there are at least 4, and we are not offering the idea that there might be monoclonal antibodies, and there's certainly Paxlovid or Molnupiravir and other ways of treating this thing should it occur as a component of how we help the patient make the decision about whether they want to booster or not. It's just not being done anywhere. And it's being pushed. The 2 versions are just being pushed by the CDC. I would argue that is virtually illegal what they're doing.
Well, certainly if what the propaganda firm, the PR firm did is...
Let's call it what it is. It's a propaganda firm. And that's, by the way, that's the other part. I want to see a law that prevents propaganda from being perpetrated on the American people. That is disgusting. But go ahead. The propaganda firm, let's call it what it is.
If a pharmaceutical company had put those ads out, then they would be liable by the FDA for violating like the kind of advertising restrictions the FDA placed on pharma. Like they would have, for instance, had to have told the public about the potential for side effects, right? They couldn't have just promised things that were beneficial about the product without also telling the potential harms, right? It's really shocking. Essentially, by most gung-ho cheerleader for the pharma industry in the history of the pharma industry. They've never had a better salespeople.
There you have it then. Jay Bhattacharya is the fox inside the big pharma henhouse. Now we have people within the NIH and the FDA and the HHS that have a very different perspective than the previous administration when it comes to putting the profits of big pharma, big food, big agriculture, although big agriculture is outside as well as aspects of big food, of their purview and remit, actually telling the truth and investigating the efficacy of medicine, the morality of the way that medical information is communicated. This is seismic and significant. Let me know, though, in the comments and the chat, if you're one of those people who feel like, nah, man, this won't work out. What I believe is the powerful interest will find ways to maneuver and manipulate and ensure that their interests are still served, regardless of who's in the White House and who's in the HHS and even who's in the NIH. But surely you feel refreshed and reassured to see Jay Bhattacharya, a good Christian gentleman, saying publicly it was $1 billion propaganda campaign. Now, this is happening, these revelations, at the same time as we know that Joe Biden has granted indemnity and a suspension of investigation into Pfizer and Moderna up until 2029, which is coincidentally when Trump's term in office ends. We know also that Kash Patel, head of the FBI, is investigating the number of FBI agents that were present on January 6th. There's so many things that are going to be revealed. This could be an exciting time if the drones and the UFOs don't stop us in our tracks. But that's just what I think. Why don't you let me know what you think in the comments and the chat. Remember, we stream on Rumble every day, and if you click the link in the description, you can get Rumble Premium. Use the code BRAND at a discounted price.